When it comes to ruthless enforcers, few can match the savagery of history's most vicious mobsters. These men weren't just gangsters, they were predators lurking in the underbelly of the criminal world, leaving behind a trail of blood and bodies. Let's investigate 5 of the most feared, brutal and bloodthirsty killers the Mafia has ever produced, starting with Louis Little New York Campagna, a monster known for his violent temper and unflinching loyalty, carved his name into Mafia legend through a series of brutal hits that left his enemies begging for mercy, if they were lucky enough to beg at all. Louis Little New York Campagna was born to the brutal streets of Brooklyn on March 31st, 1900. From the beginning, the neighborhood's pulse beat with crime, the veins of every block fed by the blood of desperation and ambition. Campagna was no different. As a boy, he drifted into petty theft and schemes like a leaf on a current, too young to know better and too dangerous to be innocent. By the time his voice deepened, he'd found his way into the infamous 5 Points gang, running errands, then muscle work for thugs who saw in him not just potential, but volatility. A pistol without a safety. His hands were already dirty, but fate had far darker stains in store for him, waiting in the shadows. It wasn't long before Louis's path collided with the man who would become his greatest benefactor and curse, Al Capone. The rising mobster saw something in the wild-eyed Brooklyn boy. Maybe it was the way Louis laughed too hard at a sick joke, or how he didn't flinch when blood splattered across his shoes in a job gone wrong. Whatever it was, Capone offered him a deal. Leave New York, come to Chicago, and protect him from the wolves on the north side. Louis didn't think twice. In the city of broad shoulders, the stakes were higher and so were the rewards. But Chicago wasn't a reprieve from violence, it was a crucible. Campagna slept with a revolver under his pillow, sometimes right outside Capone's door at the Lexington Hotel. The air was always thick with the smell of whiskey smoke and fear. They were in a war, and it was Joe Aiello who became their primary target. Aiello, a rat in Campagna's eyes, had crossed Capone by trying to poison him. The insult was unpardonable. When Aiello was locked up, Louis, reckless as ever, stormed the police station like a lunatic with 20 men in tow, guns bulging under their coats. When the cops arrested Louis on the spot, the sergeant tossed him in a cell next to Aiello as if daring them to settle it like men. Louis gripped the cold iron bars, his knuckles turning white as he spat Sicilian threats at Aiello. "You're dead," he hissed through the musty air, venomous and sure. Aiello, a once proud boss, begged like a man already buried. But Louis had no sympathy. "You dirty rat, we'll finish it." His words echoed in the small space, bouncing off the stone walls like the harbinger of death they were. The north side was a battlefield of broken promises, but this was no mere gangland beef. It was personal. When Aiello's body hit the pavement a year later, riddled with 59 bullets, the autopsy revealed a man who had been murdered twice over. No one doubted Louis had a hand in it. His rise in the Chicago outfit was cemented by blood, his loyalty measured in lives. But with Capone's conviction in 1931 for tax evasion, the winds of power shifted, and so did Louis. Paul the Waiter Rica took the helm, and Louis moved into the world of extortion and labor racketeering. The glitz and glamour of the Hollywood film industry called to him like a siren, and Louis, never one to shy away from big money, set his sights on it. He orchestrated a multi-million-dollar scheme, pulling the strings of the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees and Motion Picture Operators Union like a marionette. But the sun was setting on Campagna's unchecked rise. His frontman in Hollywood, Willie Morris Bioff, got himself arrested. Panicked and desperate, Bioff sent word to Louis from his prison cell asking to leave the outfit, to disappear quietly. Louis, ever the fatalist, paid Bioff a visit in prison. Standing over him, his voice cold, he spoke words that would make lesser men tremble. "Anybody who resigns, resigns feet first." Louis walked away, knowing full well that Bioff would either die or betray him. He gambled and lost. Bioff, terror-stricken, turned state's evidence, the noose tightening around Louis's neck in the shadows. When the hammer fell, it did so with the force of a federal indictment. In 1943, Campagna stood in court, the weight of his crimes catching up to him like a freight train on a moonless night. Convicted of extortion, he was sentenced to 10 years in the harsh, unforgiving world of the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. But Louis, as slippery as they came, had connections deeper than the cell bars that held him. His wife Charlotte appealed for his transfer, using every ounce of her influence to bring her husband closer to home. Soon, Louis found himself in Leavenworth, Kansas, a small victory in the midst of his spiral. His descent should have ended there, but men like Louis don't fall easily. After 42 months, a miracle, no, a bribe, set him free. Anthony Accardo, the new outfit boss, had greased the right palms, and Louis walked out of prison with a smirk on his face, as if daring the world to try again. His return to Chicago was met with protest from the press, from the public, but it didn't matter. Power, real power, is immune to scrutiny. By the 1950s, Louis knew the game was nearing its end. Summoned to testify before the US Senate, he gave them nothing, shrugging off their questions like he had all the bullets and bodies in his past. Still, the weight of his actions pressed down on him, an unseen hand tightening with each passing year. In the end, it wasn't a rival, a bullet, or a betrayal that took him. On May 30th, 1955, off the calm waters of Biscayne Bay, Florida, Louis hooked a 30-pound grouper. It would be his last prize. As he struggled with the fish, pulling it toward the surface, his chest tightened, the world darkening around him. Collapsing on the deck of his lawyer's boat, his heart gave out, a quiet and sudden end to a life lived at the edge of violence. The Roman Catholic Church denied him a proper funeral mass, as if even in death, Louis Campagna could find no redemption. Instead, he was buried at Mount Carmel Cemetery, beneath the cold Illinois earth, in a tomb as silent as the secrets he took with him. When you tango with the mob, even the smoothest moves can end with your body sinking to the bottom of a bay. John Handsome Johnny Roselli, a man who wore Hollywood's spotlight like a second skin, knew this better than anyone. Behind the charm, the tailored suits, and the disarming grin, Roselli was a master puppeteer, pulling the strings of organized crime from Tinseltown to Las Vegas and even into the murky depths of CIA black ops. But no amount of charisma could save him when he outlived his usefulness. In 1976, what was left of Handsome Johnny washed up in a rusted steel barrel, his glamorous life reduced to a bloated corpse and a mob hit that sent shockwaves through the underworld. Today we peel back the layers of deception, crime and murder to reveal the true darkness behind the legend. John Handsome Johnny Roselli wasn't born into power, but he certainly crafted his way there with the precision of a master forger. Before he became a shadow in Hollywood's back rooms or an unseen hand in Las Vegas, Roselli was known simply as Filippo Sacco, a name that belonged to a street kid born in Italy and raised in Boston's immigrant enclaves. By 16, he had no father, a scrappy attitude, and a mind that quickly learned the power of opportunity. It was there, in those cramped alleys where the smell of fresh bread clashed with the scent of sweat and whiskey, that Johnny first learned that survival came not from fists, but from the art of the deal. In 1922, young Sacco found himself cornered, caught by authorities on a narcotics charge. But this wasn't the end. It was the moment he shed his old skin. He fled Boston and emerged in Chicago with a new name, John Roselli. No longer just a boy from Hesperia, he was now an ambitious man ready to carve out his legacy. The streets of Chicago were his playground, where he dipped into the illegal liquor trade and worked his way up as a trusted lieutenant for Al Capone's outfit. His first rise came with blood on his hands and booze in his veins. Bootlegging was his baptism into the world of organized crime. He was no longer just a small-time crook. He became the bridge between the East Coast mobs and the West. Roselli's charm and cold calculation drew the eye of Capone himself, who saw potential in this fresh-faced criminal with an eye for detail. A chance encounter at a Dempsey-Tunney boxing match led to an invitation into Capone's inner circle. It was in the smoky back rooms of Chicago's Metropole Hotel that Roselli's real education began. Here, amidst the haze of cigars and the clinking of bourbon glasses, Roselli learned how to wield power in a way few ever could, through connections and control. He was now a player, moving from city to city, shoring up Capone's investments in places like Los Angeles, ensuring the outfit's influence spread like a cancer. Seeing the potential in film, Johnny set his sights on the glittering lights of Hollywood. In the 1930s, Louisiana was a city where dreams could be bought and sold, and Roselli knew how to profit off both. With his charisma and ruthless business acumen, he embedded himself into the highest echelons. He wasn't just another mobster shaking down starlets, he became a producer, rubbing elbows with Columbia Pictures founder Harry Cohn and backing films that glorified the very underworld from which he came. But the lights of the studio weren't enough to cast out the shadows. Roselli's true empire lay offshore in the illegal gambling racket that floated on the waters just outside LA's legal reach. Roselli's rise in Hollywood wasn't without its share of bloodshed. When the Cornero brothers tried to hold their grip on the city's offshore gambling, Roselli orchestrated a hostile takeover of their floating casino, the Monfalcone. There were no courtroom battles, only whispered threats and the quiet exchange of bribes. Roselli wasn't a man to leave loose ends, and when the dust settled, the ship was his, its once lavish casino now under the control of the outfit. He'd proven his worth again, not by brute force, but by manipulation and patience. His power climbed further, entrenched in the corrupt corridors of LA's City Hall under the administration of Mayor Frank Shaw. The same connections that gave him access to movie stars now allowed him to bribe city officials. He became the bridge between politics and crime, keeping the city's underworld running like a well-oiled machine. His final rise was perhaps the most dangerous. Roselli had made himself indispensable to both sides, but balancing such precarious positions had its cost. In the 1950s, though, the shadows Roselli once commanded started closing in on him. Jack Dragner, his longtime ally and LA's Mafia boss, passed away, and the city's power structure shifted. Roselli had to navigate this new landscape carefully, his once solid grip on LA's crime scene growing tenuous. His fall came quietly at first, as Frank DeSimone, his lawyer, and a secret mobster took the reins. Roselli was sidelined, his influence waning as younger, more ambitious criminals filled the void. But Roselli's true decline began not in Los Angeles, but thousands of miles away in Cuba. As a man who had always moved in the shadows, Roselli had crossed into an entirely different kind of darkness. In the early 1960s, Roselli was recruited by the CIA to assist in one of the most dangerous and convoluted missions of his life, the assassination of Cuban leader Fidel Castro. It seemed the government needed a man who knew how to navigate the murky waters of organized crime, and Roselli fit the bill perfectly. Using mob connections and contacts in the underworld, he orchestrated a series of failed attempts on Castro's life. Poison pills, hired assassins, and botched operations followed, each one a further blow to Roselli's reputation and psyche. By the late 1960s, Roselli's past started catching up with him. His involvement in the plot to kill Castro became public knowledge, and while many brushed off his CIA connections, the truth was far more sinister. Roselli's power waned as his enemies circled, and by 1976, it was clear that he had crossed one too many lines. He wasn't just a threat to the Mafia anymore. He was a man who knew too much about too many things. In the sweltering Miami heat, Roselli vanished. He didn't go quietly into obscurity. Instead, his life ended in a way that mirrored the violence he had long orchestrated. His bloated body was found stuffed into a steel drum, left to bob and decay in the murky waters of Biscayne Bay. The official story pointed to a mob hit, retaliation for his loose lips. But in true Roselli fashion, the real truth, like so many things in his life, remains a mystery, buried beneath the currents of history, washed away in the tide of blood and betrayal.
When Martin Moe, the Gimp Snyder, limped into a room, people didn't just step back, they ran away. A twisted soul trapped in a broken body, Snyder was the kind of gangster who made cruelty an art form. But his most chilling victim wasn't some nameless gangster, it was his own wife, the dazzling Ruth Etting. As the world watched her ascend into stardom, Snyder was lurking behind the scenes, his possessive rage festering, twisting every love song into a death threat. When his control slipped through his fingers, Snyder decided if he couldn't have her, no one would. And in a single night, what should have been a love story became a nightmare bathed in blood and gunpowder. Born into the unforgiving grime of Chicago's Southwest Side, Martin Moe, the Gimp Snyder, never had a chance at normalcy. His leg, crippled in a childhood accident, dragged uselessly behind him, a permanent reminder that life had already dealt him a bad hand. But Moe didn't seek sympathy. He hardened, turning pain into power. His rise wasn't glamorous. It was filthy, like clawing through the dirt beneath the city's streets. He dropped out of school before the ink dried on his fourth-grade report card, trading textbooks for the raw lessons of the street. A newsboy by day, he quickly graduated to shadier ventures, lurking in the shadows of Chicago's mob-connected nightclubs and alleys, where debts were collected in blood. Snyder's break came not through ambition, but aggression. He had political connections, ties to nightclubs, and knew every crook, entertainer, and thug who walked Chicago's treacherous underworld. This wasn't a man who maneuvered with finesse. He didn't charm his way to the top. He beat it out of anyone who stood in his way. His limp became less an affliction and more a signature. Mo didn't run from trouble, he brought it with him. It was at one of those dimly lit clubs where Snyder first laid eyes on Ruth Etting, a beautiful singer with the voice of an angel and the innocence to match. Mo wanted her, and when Mo wanted something, he didn't ask politely. He shoved aside his first wife like old furniture and snatched Ruth into his orbit. The marriage was less a partnership and more a hostile takeover, the kind where love suffocates under the weight of control. Mo wasn't just her husband. He was her handler, promoter, and warden, all rolled into one volatile package. By 1927, the couple had climbed the social ladder, moving to New York. Ruth's voice filled Broadway's hallowed halls while Mo lurked in the wings, scowling at anyone who dared come too close. She landed a role in the Ziegfeld Follies, a high point for her career, but a low point for their marriage. The brighter Ruth shone, the darker Mo became, jealousy twisting his features into a permanent sneer. As Ruth's fame blossomed, Mo's fuse shortened. He stalked her career like a rabid dog, snapping at producers and managers, threatening anyone who didn't bend to his will. Ruth's life became a constant performance, not just on stage, but at home, careful not to step too far out of line, lest Mo's temper boil over. Then came Los Angeles, the city of angels, but for Mo and Ruth, it was a city built on sand. Ruth landed film roles and a coveted spot on the Chase and Sanborn Hour, while Mo simmered back in Chicago, a volcano of rage, jealousy, and paranoia. His return to the Windy City wasn't a retreat, but a recalibration. While Ruth's star ascended, Mo was busy making enemies. His bullying, his brawls, his loudmouth threats, they were catching up with him. By 1934, Ruth could barely find work. Mo had torched every bridge in sight, leaving behind only smoldering ruins. The breaking point came in 1937. Ruth had endured Mo's violent rages and controlling behavior for over a decade, but she had finally had enough. She filed for divorce, citing cruelty, a word that barely scratched the surface of Mo's relentless abuse. Mo didn't contest it. He walked away with a settlement that lined his pockets and wounded Ruth's pride, but in his mind, he was far from finished. Mo disappeared for a while, like a predator stalking its prey, only to resurface in 1938, this time with murder on his mind. He began calling Ruth, his voice a slow, venomous hiss. The accusations flowed like bile. She'd hidden money from him, cheated him out of his fair share. But that wasn't the real trigger. The real offense was Merle Alderman, Ruth's accompanist and new lover. Mo's obsession curdled into something far darker. He swore he'd kill them both. At first, Ruth believed him. She hired bodyguards, but as time passed without Mo showing up, she let her guard down. It was a mistake. Mo wasn't finished. He was just waiting, festering in his rage. On a chilling October night, he struck. Merle Alderman had just finished a late-night radio gig when Mo appeared like a specter, his face twisted with hate, his gun drawn. The air was thick with tension as Mo forced Alderman into a car, barking orders as he drove them toward Ruth's house. The pistol never wavered, its cold barrel a promise of death. Inside the house, Ruth and Mo's daughter Edith were unaware of the storm about to crash through their door. When Mo arrived, he dragged Alderman into the music room like a lamb to slaughter. He shoved Ruth, his once-beloved wife, against the wall and cornered Edith. The room felt small, suffocating under Mo's presence. His eyes gleamed with madness as he waved the gun between them. There was no passion left, just fury. His voice, low and deadly, promised one thing. They were all going to die. Alderman, barely able to speak through his terror, tried to reason with him. Mo answered with a bullet. The gun roared, and the room exploded into chaos. The shot tore into Alderman's chest, dropping him like a sack of meat. Blood pooled around his body, seeping into the cracks of the hardwood floor. Mo stood over him, the smell of gunpowder still heavy in the air, and turned to Ruth. "I've had my revenge," he snarled. "Call the police." But Ruth wasn't ready to die. She bolted to her bedroom, hands shaking as she fumbled for the only gun in the house. She returned, heart pounding, desperate to protect herself and the others. But Mo, faster than she'd expected, knocked the weapon from her hands. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, spinning until it stopped at Edith's feet. In a moment of sheer terror, Edith grabbed the gun. Her hands trembled as she aimed it at her father. She fired, the shots echoing through the house. The bullets missed, slamming uselessly into the floor. Mo's eyes widened, his sneer momentarily replaced by surprise. The rage that had fueled him so long began to sputter. Edith wasn't just his daughter anymore. She was another enemy, one who had turned against him. And in that moment, Mo Snyder realized he had lost everything. The courtroom drama that followed was a grotesque spectacle. Mo, ever the manipulator, spun a tale of self-defense, claiming aldermen had shot at him first. It was a lie, but Mo clung to it, even suggesting that Ruth was still in love with him and wouldn't press charges. The jury didn't buy it. Mo was convicted of attempted murder, kidnapping, and violating California's gun laws. But like a cockroach, Mo was hard to kill. He served just 1 year behind bars before his conviction was overturned on appeal. In 1940, Alderman, now Ruth's husband, asked the court to drop the case. The charges were dismissed, and Mo crawled back to Chicago, a shadow of the man he once was. No longer the fierce gangster, no longer the feared enforcer, he lived out his final years in obscurity, working in the city clerk's office, a far cry from the violence and power he once commanded. The man who had once brought terror with every step of his lame leg had been reduced to nothing more than a footnote in the city's grim history.
At the top of the Mafia hierarchy, your death is often preordained. Stefano Bontad, known as the Prince of Villagrazia, was the elegant and ruthless boss of the Sicilian Mafia. He dined with politicians, brokered heroin deals that stretched across continents, and wielded power like a king. But even kings can fall, and Bontad's reign came to a brutal, bloody end when his ambition put him in the crosshairs of men far more ruthless than himself. Brace yourselves for a descent into a world where the price of power is measured in corpses and the echoes of gunfire mark the death knell of an empire. Stefano Il Falco Bontad was born into blood. The streets of Palermo, where he first opened his eyes on April 23, 1939, were stained with centuries of violence, and Stefano was destined to carve his name into those same cobblestones with the screams of the dying. His father, Francesco Paolo Bontade, was already one of the most feared men in Sicily, a mafia boss who governed the Santa Maria di Gesù family with the force of a tidal wave drowning the helpless. But the son, Stefano, would push the limits of brutality beyond even his father's wildest ambitions, ascending to power through a mix of cunning alliances and sheer violence that would leave the island soaked in blood. From his earliest years, Stefano was no stranger to death. It followed him like a shadow lurking just behind the elegant facade of his upbringing. Schooled by Jesuits and surrounded by wealth, Stefano learned to wear a mask of respectability, a thin veneer hiding the vicious predator beneath. His father's illness in 1964, a slow and agonizing decay that left him hollowed out and weak, gave Stefano his first taste of true power. He didn't wait for the old man to hand over control. He took it, coldly and decisively, rising to become the boss of the family at just 25 years old. His stolen kingdom ushered in a new era of bloodshed. The streets of Palermo were still littered with the corpses from the First Mafia War. Explosions ripped through the dead of night, tearing apart homes and shattering the illusion of safety. The infamous Giacoule massacre in 1963, where 7 police officers were obliterated by a car bomb, sent shockwaves through the Mafia underworld. But while others ran for cover, Stefano Bontad thrived in the chaos. He navigated the collapsing empire of the Mafia like a hyena hunting wounded prey, eliminating rivals and consolidating power while the state rounded up his less careful enemies. But survival alone wasn't enough for Bontad. He wanted an empire, one built not just on violence but on wealth, mountains of it, stained with heroin and cigarettes. The blood-soaked cobblestones of Palermo were no longer enough for him. He wanted to drown the entire island in blood money. He quickly cemented alliances with the Inzerillo clan and the American Gambino family, turning the heroin trade into his personal goldmine. The air in Palermo became thick with the acrid scent of chemicals from hidden heroin labs where men like Francesco Marino Manoia cooked the poison that would ravage entire cities. Thousands of kilos of heroin passed through Bontard's hands, flooding New York streets and lining his pockets with millions of dollars. Stefano's kingdom expanded in the shadows, but not without leaving behind a trail of broken bodies and whispered warnings. His enemies rarely saw the knife coming. They simply vanished, swallowed whole by the black maw of the Mafia's unmarked graves. It was during these years that his name became intertwined with some of the darkest conspiracies in Italy's history. Enrico Mattei, the president of Italy's state-owned oil conglomerate, ENI, had become too ambitious, too bold for the American Mafia's liking. Mattei's plane exploded mid-flight in 1962, a fiery death orchestrated by Stefano Bontard at the behest of the Americans. But Mattei was just the beginning. In 1970, journalist Mauro De Moro dug too deep into Mattei's death, inching closer to uncovering the Mafia's role in the assassination. For that, De Moro vanished into the night, his body never to be found. Stefano didn't just order the hit. He ensured De Moro's remains would never speak again, dissolving his corpse in acid, a fate reserved for those who dared to tread on Mafia secrets. In the underworld, Stefano was no longer just a kingpin, he was a phantom, a spectre of death whose very name inspired dread. But the real terror was yet to come. As the 1980s unfolded, a storm darker than any Stefano had ever seen began brewing. In the shadows of Corleone, Salvatore Toto Riina and his bloodthirsty Corleonese faction had begun their silent war, a campaign of annihilation that would leave the old Mafia world in ruins. Riina's men weren't the polished, politically connected bosses like Bontard. They were butchers, unrestrained killers who believed that anyone not with them deserved only one fate, a bullet to the skull. And Bontard, with all his power and influence, was their biggest target. The Corleonese's war began as a whisper, as bodies started to turn up in the most gruesome of fashions. Allies of Bontard, men who had once dined with him in opulence, were found riddled with bullets, their flesh torn apart by close-range shotgun blasts. Some disappeared altogether, leaving behind nothing but a foul stench of fear and rotting blood. It wasn't long before Bontard realized the noose was tightening around his own neck. Desperate to fend off the Corleonese's onslaught, Stefano made moves to strengthen his alliances with the Inzerillo and Gambino families. But Riina's vengeance was unstoppable. One by one, Bontard's soldiers fell. His grip on power loosened as Palermo's streets ran red with the blood of the Santa Maria di Gesù family. Each murder was a message. Stefano's time was coming and there would be no mercy. On April 23, 1981, his 42nd birthday, the day of reckoning arrived. The city had settled into a cold, uneasy calm as Stefano drove home after celebrating. The quiet streets of Villa Grazia, which once belonged to him, now felt foreign, threatening. He didn't know it, but his killers had been waiting, patiently tracking his every move, their rifles loaded with death. As his car cruised through the narrow alleyways, the night exploded in gunfire. The first bullet shattered the windshield, spraying shards of glass into Stefano's face. He flinched, barely comprehending the attack before a second shot tore through the side of his skull. Blood splattered across the leather seats, thick and dark, pooling around his motionless body. A final barrage of bullets hammered through the car, leaving it a smoking ruin. Stefano slumped forwards, his lifeless eyes staring blankly at the steering wheel, the once feared Prince of Villa Grazia reduced to a broken, bloodied corpse. His reign had ended in a hail of gunfire. Frank Nitti wasn't just Al Capone's right hand. He was the blade, the man who cut throats in the shadows while Capone basked in the spotlight. Known as the Enforcer, Nitti ruled over Chicago's underworld like a spectre of death, leaving a trail of blood and fear in his wake. He didn't need to pull the trigger himself. He had a legion of killers to do his bidding, but his hands were stained with the blood of rivals, lawmen, and anyone unlucky enough to cross the outfit. Yet, for all his power and cunning, Nitti's mind became his greatest enemy, leading him down a path of paranoia and self-destruction. In the end, it wasn't the police, the feds, or even rival gangsters that took him out. It was his own hand, a final, desperate act beneath the looming shadows of a Chicago train yard. Let's unravel the twisted legacy of Frank Nitti and the violent end that sealed his fate. Born Francesco Raffaellinito in a sun-baked village in Italy, Frank had tasted bitterness early. His father's death left him in the care of a stepfather whose heart was as cold as the wind that swept through their New York tenement. At 14, Frank fled that life, drawn into the arms of the streets where lawlessness reigned. The cold, early dawn of Chicago filtered through the grimy windows of a rundown barber shop. Dust danced in the slivers of pale light, barely illuminating the sharp tools on the counter. Tools that years earlier Frank Nitto had used for giving clean shaves to dock workers and local hustlers, mundane work. But that life was long gone. The windy city streets, bristling with a hunger for power and a thirst for violence that matched his own, invoked his true calling. The scent of Prohibition-era whiskey was thick in the air by the time Frank arrived in 1913, his future as unclear as the dirty windows he passed. Chicago was a city tearing itself apart, gangsters fighting over the scraps left behind by the outlawed liquor trade. Here, Frank met men who would shape his destiny. Alex Greenberg and the notorious Dion O'Banion, ruthless men with eyes always scanning the shadows for a blade aimed at their backs. Through them, Frank found his true calling: smuggling, thievery, and bloodshed. The first taste of real power came when Al Capone, himself a rising force in Chicago's criminal hierarchy, saw in Frank Nitti something familiar: an unrelenting ambition and a calmness under fire. As Capone's empire grew fat on the spoils of bootlegging, Frank quietly amassed his own reputation, becoming Capone's trusted right hand. Nitti had a mind for business, but a colder, calculated cruelty lurked beneath his businessman's facade. He was no mere thug, he was Capone's enforcer, the invisible hand guiding the bullets that tore through rival gangsters. In the late hours, as Chicago's skyline glittered with distant lights, Nitti's plans moved like clockwork. His network stretched across state lines, liquor flowing through the veins of America as he squeezed the life out of those who dared cross him. There were no safe places anymore, no corner too hidden for Nitti's reach. Yet, for all his business acumen, it wasn't Frank's mind that earned him the title of the enforcer. It was his talent for making problems disappear. Whether by his own hand or those of the hitmen he employed, those who defied the Chicago outfit ended up in shallow graves, their bodies disfigured beyond recognition by the time the police found them. A moment of tension came like a sharp intake of breath, a knife sliding too smoothly across flesh. December 19th, 1932. The room was suffocatingly hot, despite the cold winds howling outside. Frank sat behind a wooden desk at 221 North LaSalle Street, the dim overhead light flickering ominously. Detective Sergeants Harry Lang and Harry Miller burst into the room like a storm. The shots came quickly, their deafening crack tearing through the silence as Lang fired into Frank's back and neck, each bullet lodging deeper than the last. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic tang of blood. Frank hit the floor hard, the sharp pain ripping through his body like 1,000 knives. He wasn't used to being the prey, but here he was, bleeding out on the cold tiles, helpless for the first time in years. Yet death would not claim him that day. Somehow, through sheer will or spite, Nitti survived. The courtroom saw to it that justice would remain elusive, acquitting him of attempted murder as the testimonies of police corruption painted Lang and Miller as nothing more than paid assassins. Frank walked out of the courthouse with death hovering just behind him, but he had cheated it once again. That close brush with the void left Nitti changed. His every breath seemed to be a reminder that he lived on borrowed time. But fear and paranoia hadn't weakened him, they had only made him more dangerous. With Capone rotting in a prison cell, it was Nitti who now pulled the strings of Chicago's underworld. Extortion, prostitution, labor racketeering, Frank's reach extended into every vice the city offered. In the dim-lit backrooms of power, deals were brokered, lives were bartered, and Frank sat at the helm orchestrating it all. But power in the underworld is a fickle thing. As 1943 approached, the noose began to tighten. The Hollywood extortion scheme, a brilliant, audacious move, unraveled when trusted men turned informant and the indictment papers landed like the cold kiss of death. A meeting was called at Frank's house, his most loyal lieutenants circling him like wolves. Paul Rieker's eyes never left Frank, his words dripping with venom. The blame was laid squarely at Nitti's feet, his once unquestioned leadership now fraught with suspicion and anger. The outfit wanted a sacrifice, and Frank was to be its offering. Claustrophobia gnawed at his insides like a rat trapped in a cage. The thought of prison sent him spiraling into a panic, a cell, its walls pressing in on him, suffocating the very air he breathed. The memories of his first stint haunted him, and the weight of it all became too much. Death, he realized, was the only escape left. The morning of March 19, 1943, dawned cold and quiet. Frank Nitti woke, the knowledge of his fate weighing heavy on him. His wife had left for church, her absence leaving the house eerily silent. The revolver felt heavy in his coat pocket as he left, each step on the cracked pavement pulling him closer to the end. The railway tracks stretched out before him like a path to purgatory. He could hear the distant rumble of a train, its whistle cutting through the air. The workers yelled, their voices rising above the growing hum, but Nitti wasn't listening. He was already gone, lost in the fog of whiskey and regret. The first shot echoed in the cold morning air. It missed, grazing his temple. The second one shattered his calm, ripping through his jaw, but still, death refused to come. It was the third shot that finally ended it. The bullet entered behind his ear, burrowing deep into his skull, and Frank Nitti collapsed onto the tracks, his body limp and broken. The blood pooled beneath him, staining the gravel as the conductor and workers stood frozen, unsure whether to look or turn away from the grotesque scene. In the end, Frank Nitti, the man who had ruled Chicago's underworld with an iron fist, was nothing more than a corpse on the rails, his life of violence and power reduced to a stain on the city he once controlled. The Chicago outfit would continue without him, but the man who had outlived so many others, who had cheated death more times than anyone could count, had finally found his rest in the cold, unforgiving arms of the city he once owned.